Syria is close to fully retaking its strategic city of Aleppo, and anti-Assad countries and the militants they support are demanding an immediate ceasefire. Russia, Syria, and others wonder where such concern for civilians is when militants use human shields, commit atrocities, and attack government-controlled areas, injuring or even killing countless innocents. President Assad says that though the complete takeover of Aleppo would be a big win, it would not mean the end of the war with foreign-backed militancy across the country. A report details how much of a threat returning militant citizens are to Europe. The expectation of blowback of those who continue to fuel terrorism thus remains. That and more in this debate. Okay, we're going to go live now to the Syrian city of Aleppo itself, where our correspondent, Ala Ibrahim, is joining us live. Ala, tell us the latest from what you're seeing there on the ground.
Yes, in the past 12 hours, the Syrian army managed to recapture the district of Sheikh Said, making the total of the areas under the control of the Syrian army out of the areas that were under the control of the militants before 2 weeks ago. The Syrian army now controls 90% of all areas that were under the control of the militants before. The army is continuing with its military operations, though the pace of the military operation has slowed down. We have been at Bab al-Hadid crossing this afternoon local timing, and we were able to film the evacuation of over 1,000 civilians from this crossing alone. Surely you heard reports by now that there could be a cease of combat operations until the evacuation of another 8,000 will take place. But from what I see on the ground here, the military operation is slowing down, but it hasn't stopped. The army is making steady gains in eastern Aleppo, and along with that there is an active process to evacuate civilians from eastern Aleppo, and also allow civilians to go back to their houses after the areas where they were living were cleared from insurgents' presence. So the government is trying to restart life even in eastern Aleppo in areas recently retaken from insurgents.
Okay, Ala, we appreciate your reporting for us as always. That was Ala Ibrahim, Press TV's correspondent, exclusively reporting for us from the Syrian city of Aleppo itself. Let me now introduce our guests for this edition of the debate. We're joined by author and Middle East expert Dr. Kevin Barrett, who is joining us live from Madison. And we're also joined by columnist at The Hill, Mr. Brent Budowski, who is joining us live from Washington. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Mr. Budowski, there you just heard our correspondent speaking about the situation in Aleppo. I'm just wondering as to your initial thoughts about what is happening in Aleppo and the fact that the Syrian government is very close to retaking that city.
Well, if they kill everybody, they'll retake the city. That's about where we are right now. I applaud and agree with what Secretary of State John Kerry is trying to do now to negotiate a ceasefire, an evacuation, and humanitarian aid. And I also agree with what Secretary of State Kerry said about 2 months ago, that what is happening is a war crime. It is a crime against humanity. And that he called on, and I would call on again, Russia and President Putin and Assad and Syrian army to stop the deliberate, knowing, massive bombing and killing of civilians. It is a crime against humanity. It is a moral outrage in front of the world, and it needs to stop right now.
Okay, Dr. Barrett, I wanted to get your thoughts on that as well, because you know what Mr. Budowski there mentioned is something that the Western media has mentioned at several stages. I read many articles. Everyone's pretty much saying that what's the point of taking over East Aleppo if it's all destroyed?
Well, it's true that there's been horrific destruction in Aleppo and all over Syria. But I think the other guest is putting the blame on the wrong party for this. I mean, what we're seeing here is the results of a kind of a classic U.S.-sponsored regime change operation. We've seen this kind of so-called creative destruction in other parts of the world. That's what the neoconservatives call it. They say that in order to bring the blessings of democracy, which of course really means the blessings of being part of this growing empire, basically a U.S. and Western empire, and to be open to the benefits and blessings of free market capitalism, nations essentially have to see their traditional institutions, and in some cases their actual physical infrastructure and their people, destroyed. You know, Naomi Klein wrote about this in The Shock Doctrine, applied to places like Chile, where a brutal coup d'etat was imposed, and essentially people were thrown out of work in order to create this free market paradise. This has been done militarily in many other countries. And in the Middle East, since September 11th, which was a neoconservative coup d'etat, those buildings were blown up. They didn't fall down because of office fires, and they were blown up as a psychological warfare shock and awe operation against the American people, to convince the American people to support a massive series of regime change operations in the Middle East. And we've seen country after country badly damaged or destroyed. Iraq was ravaged. We've seen Sudan smashed into 2 pieces. We've seen Libya utterly and completely destroyed and turned into a failed state. And they were trying to do the same thing to Syria. And essentially, a lot of people in the region and a few people outside the region, like President Putin, said, no, the buck stops here. You're not going to cross this red line. You're not going to turn Syria into a failed state. So this intentional destruction and destabilization of Syria along a kind of U.S. imperial and Zionist doctrine that calls for the actual destruction and balkanization of the Middle Eastern countries to make them more penetrable by the empire and to make them less of a potential long and medium-term threat to the state of Israel and its expansionist aims. This is the real reason why Syria has been destroyed. So any country in the world is going to use counterinsurgency warfare to preserve its territorial integrity if there's this kind of foreign-sponsored rebellion going on. I don't have to remind the other guest what happened at Waco, Texas, when some totally harmless people simply tried to hole up in a building. They were all intentionally burned to death by orders of the American government. You can't tell me that
okay, Dr. Brett, if you saw me coming here, Dr. Brett, I do apologize for interrupting you. I just wanted to pick up on one of your points that you made there, Dr. Brett, and put that to Mr. Budowski. Mr. Budowski, I'm sure you have a response to much of what Dr. Brett there said, but I wanted to hone in, if you allow me, on one part, his mention of Iraq and Afghanistan, because, you know, many people would question, why is there so much uproar over Aleppo when, you know, we have seen destruction in many other places. We have seen, and we are still seeing, in fact, attempts to liberate many different countries, different cities, even in Iraq till now, for example, Mosul, of terrorists, of militants. Why in Aleppo do we hear of this uproar about, quote-unquote, humanitarian crisis?
Well, first of all, I have criticized operations in other countries, whether the crimes were committed by governments of the far left or the far right. What is different about Aleppo, and I'm going to ignore that blizzard of fake news, post-truth propaganda that the other fellow said when he talks about this is about an American empire. I never heard so many empty, useless, and vapid cliches that have no bearance in truth.
You're the one living in a post-truth world, sir.
What I just heard a few minutes ago right here.
You're the one purveying fake news.
Let me finish. Let me finish. No, let me finish. We're not in Russia now. I'll finish my piece, and then you can respond. And to answer the question of our host, what makes Aleppo different is that it is worse, more outrageous, and more extreme. That you have the massive, deliberate mass murder and bombing of civilians by terrorists, but also by Assad's army and also by Putin's Air Force. It is a moral disgrace. It is not the kind of thing that happens all that often. It happens in the world every so often. And before anybody wants to believe this is about the American empire, my God, I needed a raincoat after I heard that nonsense. The United Nations is not an American empire. And the United Nations has protested the same things I'm protesting right now. And
Mr. Budowski, I do apologize, Mr. Budowski, for interrupting your train of thought, but with due respect, at the United Nations, it seems that the only resolutions which ever really come forward, as in this resolution recently put forward by New Zealand, Spain, and I believe it was Egypt, this 10-day ceasefire, which they want, it's coming in because the Syrian army is clearly winning. And there hasn't been talk of what's happening in West Aleppo, is there? The fact that the militants have been attacking innocents in West Aleppo, which is a government-controlled area.
No, anybody that attacks innocents should be condemned no matter who they are. But the reason there's such an urgency to cease fire and for humanitarian aid and evacuation is not because Syria's winning or Assad's winning. It's because everybody's dying. And they're dying deaths that are preventable and immoral and illegal and outrageous and unacceptable. Now, if my friend from Wisconsin, or wherever he is, wants to talk about who's a democracy, I dare him to go to Damascus and attack President Assad and see what happens to him, or to go to Moscow and attack President Putin and see what happens to him there. Then he'll find out who's really more democratic.
Let me just get Dr.
Brett's
Brett's reaction then. Dr. Brett, Mr. Budowski is saying that the ceasefire is because of the deaths, et cetera, that are occurring. And yes, they have been occurring. No one's denying that, obviously. But doesn't it seem quite convenient that this is all happening, this demand for a ceasefire is happening right as the Syrian Arab Army is about to essentially retake the city?
Well, of course, this is a strategic move, and it's true that it's there's a terrible thing going on in Aleppo, and it needs to be stopped. But we have seen the other side, that is this foreign-sponsored insurgency, which is essentially being run by the United States and its regional allies. And the biggest winner of all of this destabilization, of course, is the expansionist, Likud-dominated, increasingly radical and genocidal government in Tel Aviv. That these folks who are dedicated to keeping this war going as long as possible and destroying Syria as long as possible find it very convenient to call for a ceasefire right at the moment that the government is retaking the city. You know, it's unfortunate, and I share the other guests' disgust with the horrible things going on there, the level of atrocities. However, I would argue that I don't think the Syrian government is going after civilians intentionally. This is just normal counterinsurgency warfare. It's exactly what the U.S. did in Iraq, and it's despicable and horrible. The difference is that the U.S. sent its soldiers halfway around the world to conduct these kinds of horrific operations as a war of aggression against the country that didn't threaten it. Whereas in Syria, what we have is the legitimate government has been targeted for overthrow and regime change by a foreign-sponsored group of countries, a group of countries that's created these horrific extremist ISIS-style mercenaries, as well as some other groups that are not quite that bad, and use that to try to overthrow the government of a sovereign nation. This is a war crime of aggression. So the same party that is basically the U.S. empire with its Zionist controllers that committed the war crime of aggression, targeting Iraq and murdering, well, over the decades, they've murdered almost 10 million Iraqis since 1950. The U.S. and Britain have killed 10 million Iraqis. And they're doing the same thing now in Syria, destroying that country in an act of aggression. The Nuremberg tribunals made a very, very clear decision that is supposed to be still standing, that the supreme war crime is aggression. And that is what is going on in the Middle East right now. Outside forces are committing that crime of aggression in Syria, just as they did in Iraq, just as they did in Libya, and in so many other places as well.
Okay, so Mr. Budowski, you know, today Robert Fisk, for example, wrote an article detailing pretty much a lot of what Dr. Barrett there said, saying that outside forces are on the ground. Essentially, they have supported militancy, especially in Aleppo, he spoke about, and certainly none of these quote-unquote terrorist militants or rebels, moderates, as Western countries may call them, none of them are really innocent, are they? They're intertwined with all sorts of terrorists, Al-Qaeda-linked groups, Daesh-linked groups. So why exactly is the West so touchy, so sensitive about them losing in Aleppo?
Well, first of all, yeah, there are a lot of crimes being committed by a lot of different players there. But I want to be clear about this. Secretary of State John Kerry, the American Secretary of State, and President Obama have been trying to negotiate a ceasefire to stop the killing for years. This is not something that they just discovered based on battlefield conditions in the last week. This is something that Secretary Kerry and American diplomats and the United Nations mediator and a lot of good people from around the world who are negotiating. We've been trying to get a ceasefire, an end to the killing, humanitarian assistance for a long time, measured in years. By no means is it any time recently when this was begun. Beyond that, though, look, what is happening? I did a presentation and a legal paper on the summation of Justice Robert Jackson at the Nuremberg trials. This is a subject I know a little bit about. And I can tell you that Justice Jackson and the Nuremberg Tribunal would not agree with one word that my colleague said today here on this show. They would want the murder, the killing, the carnage, the bombing of civilians, the killing of the innocents that is deliberate. They would want it stopped. And it may well be that the government of Syria takes over Aleppo, but that doesn't make it less of a war crime, and that doesn't mean they're going to be very happy that they did when the world looks and comes in and sees what actually happened. We need a ceasefire today. We should have had it a year ago, 2 years ago. We need it today. We need to evacuate the innocent. We need to stop killing civilians. We need to provide humanitarian aid for the suffering. We need to do it now. And I'll tell
Mr. Budowski, if you allow me, I do apologize because
any of this other
Mr.
nonsense.
Budowski, you're making it seem as if the United States and the other side has been waiting around, basically trying to get this ceasefire of some sort and humanitarian aid in. But
they have
Russia,
absolutely.
but Russia and
Absolutely.
Syria have time and again, sir, come up with ceasefires and have opened humanitarian corridors. Have in fact provided humanitarian aid of sorts to the people, and not just in Aleppo, but throughout the country. So, I mean, why not then the United States and the others, why not get on board with the Russians and help them in those humanitarian corridors instead of allowing militants to attack the humanitarian corridors?
No, I just don't agree that the Russians or the Syrians have been negotiating in good faith to get a ceasefire. And I would urge anyone in our audience who's in a country that allows internet searches, Google John Kerry Syria ceasefire. Read independent news reports, read reports from humanitarian groups, read reports from outside neutral experts, and you can see what John Kerry, who's been criticized for trying too hard by some people on the American right, look at the efforts that he has been making month after month, year after year to try to stop this killing and this carnage.
Let's get Dr. Brett's thoughts in on that then as well.
It's all in the public record.
Dr. Brett, how do you feel about this? Because, it seems that we're not agreeing on the fact that Russia and Syria have, and as you well know, have in fact brought in ceasefires, have opened humanitarian corridors time and again.
Well, that's right. And the Syrian government has also essentially offered an amnesty for, it's not going to apply to Daesh and other super extremists, but they've offered an amnesty for all Syrians, not including the outside mercenaries who've come in, the Saudis, emptying their prisons and so on. They've offered to allow these rebels to put down their guns and come back to Syria and essentially rejoin the Syrian people who have allegiance to their government and their country. And a lot of militants have, in fact, taken up that offer. Likewise, as you said, Russia and the government of Syria have indeed worked to keep open humanitarian aid corridors, and there have been pushes for various kinds of solutions, not just temporary ceasefires, but permanent solutions, primarily coming from the Syrian and the Russian side. But it's really been not so much Kerry himself, but others from his side who've been continuing to supply these various rebel groups and these terrorists with their weapons. We have the Kurds, U.S.-supported Kurds, complicit with ISIS, selling ISIS oil through Turkey to Israel. It's essentially the U.S. allies in the region who have been pumping up the weapons and pushing their mercenaries into Syria. So even while Kerry has been ostensibly trying to get a ceasefire, others on the side of the destabilizers have been continuing to fund the insurgency. It's been a double game, and it's a strategic double game. And again, as I said earlier, this is intentional. This wasn't just a random Arab Spring thing that just happened and got out of control. This has been planned for years. There are documents that have been declassified showing that the U.S. was planning to destabilize Syria and have regime change. These documents go back to shortly after 9/11. So this is a long-term plan, just as it was in Libya. The Libyan revolution was so-called revolution was carried out by CIA mercenaries who'd been trained for decades in eastern Libya, waiting for the moment to arrive. So again, we have to think of this, we have to look at the big picture here and see that this is a case of imperial aggression, intentionally destroying societies in order to overthrow governments that are not cooperating sufficiently with the empire. And that has to end. And maybe we're moving into a new era now when this Syrian destabilization program has failed. Maybe it really will stop here. Maybe this will set enough of an example that the people who believe in creative destruction, the neoconservatives who want to run all over the world doing this to country after country after country, are going to be told to stop. And if that happens, it's really it's it's about time, because we've seen so much of this kind of carnage over the years, and maybe the buck will finally stop here in Syria.
Okay, so Mr. Budowski, I want to pick up on the last point Dr. Barrett there made, and of course allow you to respond to his other points as well, but I wanted to pick up on that because it is important to highlight that, isn't it? Because we have had blowback from Daesh, for example, Daesh attacks in many capitals in Europe. We just had a report today come out which says that upwards of 5,000 Europeans have joined Daesh, and upwards of at least a third of them have returned, and there are fears, and the report very clearly says some of those people coming back are very radicalized. They may very well carry out new attacks in Europe. So this policy really vis-a-vis Syria has failed, hasn't it? Because at the end of the day, it is allies of the West, be it the Persian Gulf Arab countries, the dictatorships, or others who have, at the end of the day, they're the ones who are the root cause of why Daesh even came to be formed, isn't it?
Well, first of all, there has been some progress in the last several months against ISIS, or Daesh, whoever we call them. It has gotten a little better, but it's been much too late, much too little. Frankly, I've been more conservative than President Obama and even many Republicans. I would have done far more, and I said it here, and I said it on Middle East TV elsewhere, and I said it in my column in the United States, and I said it on American TV. I want to kill the bums. I would have been much more aggressive to kill ISIS than President Obama or many other people. On that level, we had to do more. There has been some progress, but let's be clear. President Barack Obama, that is absolute lie. That's a complete lie. The United States government did not create ISIS. I don't have enough trench coats to wear to cover that mud. I'll just go on to the rest of my point and just limit it to saying it's a lie, a total lie, to say you've been reading too much Russian propaganda, to be honest.
About the Salafist principality in Iraq and Syria?
There is no CIA memo. There is no CIA memo about America supporting ISIS.
Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA.
No, well, there's no DIA memo about the United States supporting ISIS.
Looking forward to the creation of a Salafist principality in Iraq and Syria, sir.
There is nobody at the DIA, the CIA, the NSA, the USA that advocates that. You guys, I don't know where you get this garbage, but with all due respect, you really have to get real, and our audience needs to understand. Just because somebody says something.
Salafist principality in Iraq and Syria.
Okay, you found it on Google. Okay, good for you. There's nothing on Google that is from the CIA, the DIA, the NSA, or the USA about creating or supporting or funding ISIS. End of discussion. Any other opinion is
from WikiLeaks.
I don't know what WikiLeaks says about everything, but there was no authentic CIA or DIA memo ever about the United States creating or supporting ISIS. That's just a lot of garbage. And I don't even want to waste the audience time debating that. What John Kerry is doing now is right. What he's been trying to do now for 3 years, 2 years, 1 year, 1 week, 1 day today is right. They have to stop the killing of civilians. They have to have a ceasefire. They have to stop the carnage. They have to stop bombing innocent people.
Mr. Budowski, I'll have to come in here. I do apologize. Dr. Brent, we have under 30 seconds. Go ahead with your final comments, Dr. Brent.
Well, the one thing I agree with the other guest about is that this fighting needs to end. If indeed there was a way to permanently end the fighting through a temporary ceasefire that would somehow grow into a larger peace, that would be great, and I would be all for it. Unfortunately, in the real world, probably the only way that Syria is going to be stabilized is under the current Syrian government.
Dr. Brett. It seems like the clock has gotten the best of us. I do apologize, gentlemen. We'll have to have you both on later on to continue this conversation. That was author and Middle East expert Dr. Kevin Barrett, who had been speaking to us live from Madison, and we were also joined by columnist of The Hill, Mr. Brent Budowski, who had been speaking to us live from Washington. And of course, viewers, we appreciate you joining us as well. Until next time, good night.